The car ride was silent, the tension thick enough to suffocate. Solene Ashford sat rigidly in the back seat, her fingers curled into fists on her lap. Outside, the neon lights of the city blurred past, mocking the contrast between the world she once knew and the one she was being forced into. When the car stopped in front of Vaughan Tower, the imposing skyscraper loomed above her like an unbreakable wall. A cold gust of wind swept through the open door as the driver stepped out, offering no words, just expectation. Solene lifted her chin. She would not cower. Inside, the penthouse was a reflection of the man who owned it. Sleek, expensive, lifeless. Dark marble floors stretched beneath dim lighting, the walls bare except for towering windows that revealed the city skyline. It was beautiful in a way that felt empty. A deep voice broke the silence. "You took long enough." Cassian Vaughn stood at the far end of the room, hands in his pockets, his suit sharp and pristine. Everything about him radiated control. His stance, his voice, his eyes, which held no warmth, only calculated indifference. Solene's heartbeat quickened, but she held his gaze, refusing to shrink under his scrutiny. "Do I get a say in this?" Her voice was steady. Cassian arched a brow, amusement flickering across his face before vanishing just as quickly.
No.
He stepped closer, his presence unnervingly powerful. "You belong to me now." A chill ran down her spine, not from fear, but from something else. Anger, defiance, a flicker of something reckless. Solene took a slow breath. If he expected obedience, he would be disappointed. She was not a girl who bowed to power. Her lips curled slightly as she met his gaze, her voice calm yet laced with steel. "Then let me show you what it means to own a fire." For the first time, something shifted in Cassian's expression. Interest, annoyance, maybe even a sliver of something more dangerous. A storm was brewing between them, and neither of them knew who would survive it. The silence of the penthouse was oppressive. Solene lay on the massive bed in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, sleep refusing to come. The space around her was pristine, untouched, like a showroom rather than a home. The coldness of it settled deep in her bones. She wasn't afraid. Not exactly. Unease curled inside her, not from the fact that she was here, trapped in Cassian Vaughn's world, but from the man himself. He was unreadable, controlled, but beneath that exterior, there was something wrong. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet making no sound against the floor. If she was to survive here, she needed to understand him. Moving cautiously, she stepped into the hallway. The penthouse was massive, but despite its size, there was something eerily empty about it. No signs of life, no personal touches, just a fortress of glass and steel. A faint sound pulled her attention. Through the dimly lit open space, she spotted him. Cassian stood by the bar, alone, staring at the skyline. Solene stilled. He hadn't seen her. A tumbler of dark liquid rested in his hand, his grip almost too tight, his fingers flexing around the glass. He lifted it to his lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. Then another. The muscles in his jaw tensed. She watched as he set the glass down, then pressed his hands against the edge of the counter, his head bowing slightly. Not in exhaustion, in restraint. The room smelled faintly of whiskey, and now that she was paying attention, she saw the evidence of something deeper. The untouched meal left out from earlier. The way his shoulders were drawn tight with tension, the exhaustion carved into his face. He didn't sleep. He barely ate. And he drank just enough to take the edge off, but not enough to lose control. For a man who had power over everything, he seemed to be fighting a battle no one else could see. Before she could turn back, his voice sliced through the quiet. "I know you're there." Solene froze. Cassian turned his head slightly, his gaze finding hers across the room. His expression was unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. "Do you make a habit of sneaking around?" His voice was smooth, unbothered. "Do you make a habit of drinking alone in the dark?" She shot back. A shadow of amusement crossed his face before it disappeared. "Go back to bed, Solene." It wasn't a request. Then his phone vibrated against the counter. His entire demeanor shifted. Tension rippled through his frame, his grip tightening around the glass before he set it down with controlled precision. The phone rang once, twice. Then he answered. I told you not to call me. His voice was lower now, edged with something dangerous. A pause. I don't care what you have. If you make this public, I will bury you. Solene felt something cold settle in her chest. Whoever was on the other end of that call had power over him, and she intended to find out why. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the vast emptiness of the penthouse. Solene sat at the long dining table, untouched breakfast in front of her, her fingers curling around the edge of the chair. Across from her, Cashin sipped his coffee, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm but laced with authority. There are rules. She met his gaze, unmoving. You don't speak unless spoken to. You don't touch anything that isn't yours. And you don't leave this penthouse. Ever. Solene let the weight of his words settle. Rules. A cage wrapped in luxury. She lifted her chin slightly. And if I do? Cashin set his cup down with controlled precision. You won't. There was no need for threats. His certainty was enough. But Solene had never been one to follow orders without reason. The first test came that afternoon. She wandered the penthouse, fingers brushing over the cold, pristine surfaces. She didn't break his rule, not entirely. She wasn't touching his things, merely observing them. The difference was subtle, but she knew men like Cashin lived on control. Every small defiance was a thread pulled loose. When he found her in his private study, skimming the spines of expensive first editions, she expected anger. Instead, he watched her with something sharper. You don't listen. Solene turned, meeting his eyes with an almost imperceptible smirk. You don't like being ignored. His jaw ticked. In 2 strides, he closed the space between them, his hand catching her wrist before she could step away. The room tensed around them. His grip was firm but not cruel. You think this is a game? He asked, his voice low, measured. I think you want it to be. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken things. But then, just as quickly as he had grabbed her, he let go. A retreat. Solene took a breath, steadying herself. She wasn't afraid of him, and that was the real problem. Later that night, Cashin found her again. In the dim glow of the library, she was curled up in one of his chairs, reading. His shirt hung loosely over her frame, swallowing her in fabric that didn't belong to her. Cashin exhaled, stepping inside. That's mine. She didn't even look up. Then maybe you shouldn't leave it where someone might take it. This time, he didn't stop her. The air in the penthouse shifted subtly over the next few days, tension creeping in like an unseen force. Cashin was different, more distant, more irritable. His usual air of control remained, but there were cracks forming, cracks that Solene was starting to notice. She first sensed the change after a phone call. Cashin had answered in his office, his voice low and clipped, but the sharpness in his tone carried through the thick walls. She had only caught a name. Juliet. Solene didn't know much about the world Cashin lived in, but she knew that name belonged to trouble. Later that evening, as she wandered the penthouse, she stumbled upon something odd. A door, unlike the others, locked. She had never seen Cashin enter or leave through it, and in a place where everything was pristine and curated, the presence of something forbidden stood out. Her fingers hovered over the handle, testing it lightly. Locked, as expected. But why? Before she could investigate further, Cashin appeared. You're running out of ways to push me. Solene turned slowly. His gaze was unreadable, but there was something colder in his expression. She tilted her head. I was just looking around, and now you're done. The sharp finality in his voice sent a message. Whatever was behind that door, he wasn't going to let her near it. That night, she barely slept. At some point, in the thick silence of the early hours, a sound pulled her from the edge of rest. A voice. Low, pained. She hesitated before slipping out of her room. The penthouse was dark, but the glow from Cashin's bedroom door, half open, guided her steps. She shouldn't have gone in, but she did. Cashin was twisted in the sheets, his breathing uneven, his forehead damp with sweat. The tension in his body was unmistakable. A nightmare. Solene hesitated only a second before she reached out, her fingers barely grazing his shoulder. The reaction was instant. Cashin jerked awake, gripping her wrist so tightly she gasped. His breathing was ragged, his eyes unfocused for a fraction of a second before the sharp clarity returned. He let go as if burned, his face hardening. "Don't touch me." Solene swallowed the sting of his words, but didn't look away. Cashin turned from her, running a hand down his face. Whatever she had just seen, whatever haunted him in the dark, he would never let her close enough to understand it. It happened without warning. Solene had spent the evening keeping to herself, flipping through books in the library, trying to ignore the undercurrent of tension that had taken root in the penthouse. Cashin had been colder, harsher, ever since that nightmare she had witnessed. Now, in the dead of night, she heard something that made her freeze. A crash. She stood abruptly, her pulse kicking up. For a moment, she debated ignoring it. Let him handle himself, let him drown in whatever storm was consuming him. But she moved before she could stop herself. The dimly lit living room was silent but wrong. The smell of whiskey lingered in the air, and then she saw him. Cashin lay on the floor, half conscious, one hand gripping the edge of the couch as if he had tried to pull himself up. A shattered glass lay nearby, dark liquid staining the floor. Solene rushed to his side, hesitating only a second before touching his shoulder. His skin was burning. Cashin. His eyes fluttered open, glassy, unfocused. His breath came in shallow drags, his face drawn in exhaustion. He had pushed himself too far. Again, her fingers brushed over his pulse, steady but erratic. He needed water, rest, anything but more alcohol. She moved to help him up, but his fingers suddenly curled around her wrist, stopping her. His voice was barely above a whisper, rough from sleep, or from something deeper. "It was never supposed to be me." The words sent a shiver down her spine. "What?" Solene frowned, leaning closer. "What wasn't?" But Cashin was slipping again, his grip loosening, his body giving in to exhaustion. Whatever he had meant, he wouldn't be saying anything else tonight. She exhaled, carefully maneuvering him onto the couch. It was the first time she had seen him like this. Not the cold, untouchable man, but something fragile beneath the surface. By the time morning came, Solene had barely slept. She heard him before she saw him. The sharp, angry clatter of a cup hitting the counter in the kitchen. When she stepped inside, Cashin was already dressed, his back to her, tension radiating off him. Then he turned. His eyes locked onto her, dark and unreadable. "You will not speak of last night. Ever." His voice was like steel, but she didn't miss the tightness in his jaw. He was furious, not at her, but at himself, for letting her see the cracks. Solene, to his surprise, simply tilted her head. "Then maybe next time, you should take better care of yourself." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. The tension in the penthouse had shifted from silent wariness to something sharper. Solene could feel it in the way Cashin's gaze lingered on her just a fraction longer than before. Not with curiosity, but calculation. Something had changed. She noticed it first in the way his phone calls had become more frequent, his voice colder, more clipped. Magnus Dorian's attacks were intensifying, his empire under fire. Then came Juliet. Solene hadn't met her, but she didn't have to. She recognized the signs. Whispers slipping through the cracks, tension winding tighter around Cashin. She had seen the way Cashin studied her now, not with the same silent intrigue from before. With doubt, Juliet was planting seeds, twisting something in Cashin's mind, making him wonder if Solene was something more than what she seemed. And then Solene found the article. It wasn't hidden, but it wasn't exactly left out in the open either. It had been tucked between the pages of a book, folded, creased as if read too many times. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, but the headline was clear enough. Nicholas Hale, heir to Hale Industries missing, presumed dead. She read it twice, her breath caught somewhere between shock and understanding. Cashin Vaughn didn't exist. Not really. The sound of footsteps behind her sent ice down her spine. She barely had time to react before the newspaper was ripped from her hands. When she turned, Cashin was staring at her, eyes burning with something dark. "Where did you find this?" His voice was low, controlled, but she could hear the edge, the warning beneath it. Solene met his gaze, refusing to back down. It was here. You kept it. His jaw clenched. That doesn't mean you were meant to see it. She exhaled, steadying herself. Who is Nicholas Hale? A dangerous silence fell between them. For a moment, she thought he might answer, that he might finally let her in. But then the walls snapped back into place. Forget you ever saw this. She watched as he crushed the paper in his hand, his expression cold, detached. But Solene had seen it now, and she wasn't the type to forget. Cashin didn't sleep that night. He stood by the window, watching the city sprawl beneath him, the lights flickering like dying embers. No amount of power, no name he built for himself, could erase what he used to be. Nicholas Hale. The name clawed its way back from the grave, dragging old ghosts with it. He had buried that life long ago, or so he thought. But now Solene knew. He clenched his fists, frustration coiling in his chest. She wasn't supposed to see that article. She wasn't supposed to dig where she didn't belong. Yet, a part of him knew this was inevitable. The past had always been waiting for him to slip. By morning, he found her in the library, sitting cross-legged on the couch, a book open in her lap. But she wasn't reading. She was waiting. She didn't look surprised when he walked in. "You're avoiding me." Cashin exhaled slowly. "I don't owe you an explanation." Solene tilted her head. "You do if you expect me to live in a house built on secrets." He clenched his jaw. He had been through enough negotiations to recognize a battle of wills. And yet, this was different. She wasn't asking for power. She wasn't threatening leverage. She just wanted the truth. For the first time in years, he considered giving it. He sat across from her, leaning forward, resting his forearms on his knees. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but sharp. Nicholas Hale died the night his family did. Solene's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes softened. She didn't push, didn't demand more. So he kept going. His father had been a ruthless businessman, the kind that didn't make enemies. He made executioners. One night, when Nicholas was 17, the consequences of that life came knocking. Fire, glass shattering, screams. Nicholas had barely made it out. His family hadn't. His survival had been a mistake, one the people responsible would have corrected had he stayed Nicholas Hale. So he became someone else. Cashin Vaughn, built from ashes, forged in control, untouchable. Solene studied him, absorbing his words. She didn't offer empty sympathy, didn't whisper useless comforts. Instead, she said the one thing he wasn't expecting. "You're still running." Cashin's eyes snapped to hers, something sharp in his expression. But Solene didn't waver. "You act like Nicholas Hale is gone, but he's still inside you. And no matter how much you try to bury him, the past always finds a way back." Her words lingered long after she left the room. And for the first time in years, Cashin wasn't sure if he had truly outrun the boy he used to be. The dress was designed to blend her into the world Cashin lived in. Sleek, elegant, deceptively simple. But as Solene stared at herself in the mirror, she knew the fabric wasn't what made her stand out. It was the fact that she didn't belong. Cashin had said nothing on the drive to the event. He hadn't explained why he was bringing her, only that she would listen, observe, and not embarrass him. But Solene had no intention of playing his perfect little pawn. The gala was a spectacle of wealth and power, chandeliers dripping light over a sea of silk and diamonds. The room buzzed with whispers, deals being made behind polite smiles, alliances shifting beneath the surface. Solene could feel the weight of their curiosity as Cashin led her inside. Who is she? Why is she here? She was a disruption, and Juliet Wolfe despised disruptions. What a surprise! Juliet's voice purred as she approached, eyes scanning Solene like she was an uninvited guest at a private table. She barely spared Cashin a glance. This wasn't about him. This was a test. Solene met her gaze head-on. "I do love surprises." A flicker of amusement crossed Juliet's expression before it curled into something sharper. "How charming," she said, tilting her head. "I imagine it must be overwhelming. Stepping into a world that isn't yours." Cashin remained silent, watching, waiting. Solene smiled, calm, unaffected. "Oh, I don't know. It seems simple enough. She gestured around them. Money. Status. Thinly veiled insults wrapped in expensive dresses. Juliet's lips parted slightly, surprised, not at the words, but at the delivery. Cashin's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Soline tilted her head. Tell me, Juliet, how long did it take you to master the art of pretending you don't care when Cashin doesn't choose you? The sharp intake of breath from nearby guests told her she had struck where it hurt. Juliet's expression didn't falter, but something behind her eyes flared. Anger, maybe even hatred. Cashin finally spoke, voice smooth. Enough. It wasn't a reprimand. It was a closing statement. Juliet, composed once more, smiled coldly and slinked away, but the damage had been done. Soline could feel Cashin's gaze on her. Not angry, not impressed. Something else. When they left the party, Cashin finally broke the silence. You enjoyed that too much. Soline smirked, looking out at the city lights. So did you. For once, he didn't argue. The tension had been simmering since the gala. Unspoken, unavoidable. Soline could feel it in the way Cashin watched her. Not with the same cold calculation as before, but with something rawer, something unsettled. She was getting to him, and he hated it. She found him in the library that night, standing by the shelves with a tumbler of whiskey in his hand. His posture was stiff, shoulders taut like a man holding back something he refused to name. I assume I should be thanking you, Cashin said without looking at her. For that little display with Juliet. Soline crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. You assume wrong. He turned then, his gaze sharp. You shouldn't have provoked her. She provoked me first. Cashin exhaled harshly, setting the glass down with more force than necessary. That's not how this world works. Then maybe your world is broken. Silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. Soline refused to look away first. Cashin clenched his jaw. You don't belong here. Soline took a step forward. And yet, here I am. Something flickered in his expression. Anger, frustration, something else. You should be afraid of me. His voice was lower now, almost careful. I'm not. He let out a quiet laugh, but there was no amusement in it. He took a step closer, the air between them tightening. Then you're a fool. Maybe. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Or maybe I just see you for what you really are. Cashin's breath hitched, just barely. For the first time since she had met him, he looked unsteady. His hand lifted slightly, like he was going to reach for her. But then he stopped, fingers curling into a fist instead. You terrify me. The words were so quiet she almost thought she imagined them. Soline's lips parted, heart pounding. He had admitted it. Not his power, not his past, but her. She was the thing that shook him. His gaze dropped to her lips for half a second, just long enough to steal her breath. Then, just as quickly, he stepped back. His walls slammed back into place. Go to bed, Soline. His voice was flat now, detached. She swallowed the sting in her chest but didn't argue, because for the first time, she had seen something Cashin Vaughn didn't want her to see. And he was the one running now. Cashin's patience had already been razor-thin. The last few days had left him teetering between control and something he refused to name. Then came the betrayal. Soline wasn't supposed to be in the room when it happened, but she had lingered just outside his office door, drawn in by the heated argument within. You sold information. Cashin's voice was low, dangerous. To Magnus. A beat of silence. Then, a voice, one she recognized. Darren, Cashin's right-hand man. Or at least, he had been. It wasn't what you think. It was exactly what I think. The sound of something shattering, glass against a wall. You were the only person I trusted. Darren tried to plead, but Cashin's next words cut through it. You're done. The doors swung open, and Soline barely had time to step aside before Darren stormed past, his expression dark. Cashin emerged a second later, his face unreadable. But his hands were clenched, his breathing steady in the way a man contained a storm. She didn't speak. Not now, because whatever rage simmered beneath his skin, it wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about what it confirmed, that he was always alone. The threat came later that night. Solene had stepped onto the penthouse balcony, drawn by the need for fresh air. The city stretched beneath her, endless, shimmering with light. For once, she allowed herself to breathe. Then she felt it, the weight of being watched. She turned just as a dark figure stepped from the shadows. "You don't belong here." The voice was smooth, practiced. A man in a suit, the kind who blended into crowds too easily. Her pulse spiked, but she didn't move, didn't show fear. "And you are?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. The man smirked. "Someone who cleans up messes. And right now, you're making one." Her stomach tightened. Before she could react, a new presence entered the space. Cashin. His movements were calm but final, a predator stepping into place. The man took a step back, just slightly, but it was enough. Cashin's voice was ice. "If you touch her, you won't leave this city breathing." The stranger didn't argue. He simply smiled, retreating into the shadows as easily as he had appeared. When Cashin turned to Solene, his expression was unreadable, but his hand was on her wrist, tight and steady. "Stay inside." It wasn't a request, and this time, Solene didn't argue. The storm outside mirrored the one inside Cashin. Hours had passed since the encounter on the balcony, yet the weight of it still coiled in his chest. Someone had tried to warn Solene away. That meant they saw her as a weakness, his weakness. And maybe they weren't wrong. Solene hadn't said much since he ordered her inside, but she hadn't looked afraid, either. Instead, she watched him carefully, like she was waiting for him to admit something he refused to say. He had told himself to leave her alone for the night. That distance was necessary. But then he found her sitting on the couch in the dim glow of the living room, curled into herself, sleep tugging at her, but never quite winning. Cashin exhaled slowly. "Why are you still awake?" Solene blinked, her gaze meeting his. "I don't know." A lie. He knew because he felt it, too. The lingering unease, the way the night felt different, heavier. Cashin hesitated only a second before he sat down beside her. Neither of them spoke. Then, so softly he almost missed it, she said, "Do you ever sleep?" He let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Not well." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else. Understanding. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was something much more dangerous. But when Solene shifted, resting her head lightly against his shoulder, he didn't pull away. She was warm, steady, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was teetering on the edge of something inevitable. His body betrayed him first, his muscles slowly unwinding, the exhaustion finally catching up. Cashin Vaughn, who never let anyone close, who never allowed vulnerability, let his eyes close. And for the first time in a long, long time, he slept. When he woke, the warmth beside him was gone. Blinking against the early morning light, Cashin sat up, his body stiff but rested. Then he saw it. A small note, neatly folded, sitting on the coffee table. His chest tightened as he reached for it, unfolding the paper with slow, careful fingers. "You don't have to be alone anymore." The handwriting was small, precise. Hers. Cashin exhaled, pressing his thumb against the edge of the note, as if he could erase the way it made him feel. He couldn't, and that was the problem. Cashin knew this day would come. He sat in his office, fingers pressed together, watching the city through the glass walls. The skyline stretched endlessly before him, but the weight in his chest made it feel like a prison instead of an empire. The past never stayed buried. Elias Cross was proof of that. The office doors swung open without warning. Cashin didn't turn. He didn't need to. "Still living like a king, I see." The voice was familiar. Low, edged with resentment. A ghost given flesh. Slowly, Cashin turned his chair. Elias stood just inside the room, his presence unchanged despite the years. Same sharp gaze. Same quiet fury simmering beneath the surface. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Cashin said smoothly, leaning back. "Took you long enough." Elias smirked, but there was no humor in it. "You don't get to act like this is casual, Vaughn." His voice turned sharp, laced with something deeper. "Or should I say, Hale?" Cashin didn't flinch, but something inside him coiled tight. That name doesn't exist anymore. Elias stepped closer. It does to me. The silence between them thickened. Years of unfinished business settling into the space. Cashin had wronged Elias once. He had made a choice that left blood on both their hands, and now Elias had come to collect. I lost everything because of you, Elias said, voice low. You climbed your way out, stole a new life, and left the rest of us to burn. Cashin exhaled, steady. And now? Elias tilted his head. Now you pay. Cashin studied him, considering. He had known this moment would come, but what he hadn't accounted for was the risk to Solene. If Elias was here, others would come, and the closer Solene got to him, the more danger she was in. This wasn't just about old betrayals anymore. It was about who Cashin was willing to protect. Elias leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. It must be exhausting, keeping up the lie. Cashin's fingers curled into fists against his desk, but his expression never wavered. You should be careful, Cross. His voice was dangerously quiet. You're not the only one who's been waiting for this day. For the first time, Elias hesitated. Then he smiled, a slow, knowing thing. We'll see who survives it then. And just like that, the war Cashin had been avoiding had finally begun. The storm outside had nothing on the one building inside Cashin. He paced the dimly lit penthouse, whiskey untouched on the table, mind tangled in the inevitability of what had been set in motion. Elias was back. The past was no longer just a shadow lurking behind him. It was standing at his door, demanding retribution. And then there was Solene. She wasn't supposed to matter. She wasn't supposed to be a variable in his carefully controlled world. But she was. He found her in the library again, curled into the armchair, staring at the rain streaking against the windows. When she looked up, there was no hesitation in her gaze. She knew he was unraveling, knew that something had shifted between them the moment he let his guard down. Cashin exhaled, stepping closer. You should leave. Solene didn't flinch. You don't want that. He clenched his jaw. I don't have a choice. Her lips parted slightly, something flickering in her expression. That's not true. She said it so quietly, so simply, like it was a fact rather than a reckless, impossible idea. Cashin had always been a man who held power over everything. People, businesses, the secrets others tried to keep. But he couldn't control this. Her. The way she made him feel. He reached for her before he could stop himself. His fingers found her wrist first, sliding up the length of her arm until he could feel her pulse beneath his thumb. It was steady, but beneath it, something quickened. Hers. Or his. He wasn't sure anymore. This is a mistake, he said, his voice rough. Solene took a slow breath, her gaze never leaving his. Then why are you still holding on? He was losing this battle. He had been from the beginning. And then she closed the distance. The kiss was not gentle. It was fierce, consuming, filled with everything they had tried to deny. Her hands fisted into the front of his shirt, pulling him closer, and Cashin let himself break. He had kissed plenty of women before, but not like this. Not like she was something he would regret letting go of. Not like she was something he was afraid to want. His hands slid to her waist, fingers tightening, grounding himself in the reality that she was here, real, against him. But then, just as quickly as it started, Cashin pulled away. His breath was unsteady, his forehead resting against hers, his world shifting beneath him. This changes nothing, he murmured, a final, desperate lie. Solene let out a soft, knowing breath. If that were true, you wouldn't have stopped. She was right, and that terrified him more than anything. The silence between them was suffocating. Solene stood in the center of Cashin's office, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression carefully blank, too blank, but her eyes, dark and sharp, held something he had never seen directed at him before. Betrayal. Cashin exhaled, bracing his hands against the edge of his desk. He had spent years keeping the truth buried, making sure no one could use it against him. But Solene had found the cracks. And now there was no turning back. Say it. Her voice was quiet, but there was no softness in it. Cashin's jaw clenched. You already know. I want to hear it from you. He forced himself to look at her. She deserved that much. No more half-truths. No more diversions. Elias Cross lost everything because of me. The words hung between them, and for the first time, Cashin saw her waver. She took a step back, like she needed more space between them. Between who she thought he was and the man standing in front of her. You destroyed him, she said, more to herself than to him. Cashin didn't try to deny it. There was no use. I did what I had to do, he said. Solene let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. Is that how you justify it? Cashin straightened, his expression hardening. He made a move against me first. He put himself in the game and he lost. A game? Her voice rose, the careful restraint slipping. You ruined his life, Cashin, and you never once thought to tell me? It had nothing to do with you, but it does now. The weight of her words hit harder than he expected. Solene ran a hand through her hair, exhaling sharply, trying to collect herself. But he could see it. Something had shifted between them. She had seen his darkness before, but now? Now she had proof of just how deep it ran. Finally, she met his gaze again, her voice quieter but no less cutting. You kept this from me. You let me stand here. Let me. She shook her head, unable to finish. I don't even know who I'm looking at right now. Cashin stepped forward instinctively, but she lifted a hand between them. Not now. Not yet. The distance felt heavier than anything he had faced before. And for the first time, Cashin had no idea how to fix it. The accusation came swiftly. Cashin had spent the entire morning in meetings, locked in tense negotiations as the fallout from Elias's return sent ripples through his business. He had barely spoken to Solene since their argument. Maybe that was his mistake. By the time he returned to the penthouse, Juliet was already waiting. She stood near the bar, a glass of red wine in hand, watching him with an expression of carefully concealed amusement. Juliet never showed up without an agenda. You're in a difficult position, Cashin, she mused, swirling the wine. You trust too easily. Cashin exhaled sharply. If you have a point, get to it. She smiled. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but your little guest? She took a slow sip. She's been selling information to Magnus. The words settled like ice in his veins. Cashin didn't react, didn't let his expression change. That was the only way to survive in his world. Control, always control. You're lying. Juliet sked softly. Am I? She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it onto the counter. Cashin hesitated before flipping it open. Inside were copies of emails, transaction records, communications between Solene and someone on the inside of Magnus Dorian's company. It wasn't possible. Solene wasn't involved in this world. She barely understood the stakes at play. And yet, the evidence was there. A single, final blow. An audio file of a conversation. He pressed play. A woman's voice, Solene's, came through the speakers. I got what you needed. Cashin's grip tightened on the file, his pulse hammering in his ears. It wasn't just the words. It was the betrayal. He had let her in. He had trusted her, against every instinct. And now this. Juliet studied him, waiting for the reaction she wanted. She didn't care about Solene's guilt, only about the damage this would cause. Cashin shut the file and set it down. Leave. She lifted a brow. You're not even going to fight this? I said leave. Juliet smirked but said nothing more. She had already won. Solene barely had time to process the cold fury in Cashin's eyes before the words left his mouth. You need to go. She froze. What? Cashin's expression was unreadable, but his voice was edged in steel. Now. Something was wrong. She could feel it. Cashin. What's happening? His hands curled into fists at his sides. You played me. Her breath caught. What are you talking about? He tossed the folder onto the table between them. You tell me. She grabbed the file, flipping through the contents. Confusion shifted to shock, then disbelief. You think this is real? Her voice was shaking. You think I did this? Cashin didn't move, didn't blink, and that was what shattered her. He believed it. Everything, the nights spent breaking through his walls, the stolen moments where he let himself be human. It meant nothing now. Solene's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stand tall. She would not beg. She would not break. Instead, she dropped the file onto the floor and met his gaze one last time. "If you think I betrayed you, you never really knew me." Cashin said nothing. So Solene turned and walked out, and he let her. The penthouse felt different without her. Cashin had spent years in solitude, building walls so high that no one could reach him. He had convinced himself he preferred it that way. But now it felt empty. He stood in the dim glow of the library, staring at the space where she used to sit, her legs tucked beneath her, lost in books that didn't belong to her but that she claimed anyway. He had told himself this was inevitable, that she was never meant to stay. Then why did it feel like something had been ripped out of him? The file with the false accusations sat untouched on his desk. He had been so quick to believe it. Too quick. Because it had been easier to push her away than to face what she meant to him. His fingers curled into fists, rage simmering beneath the surface. Not at Solene, but at himself. She had asked him to believe in her, and he hadn't. A sharp knock broke through the silence. Cashin turned as Reese, his security chief, stepped inside. His expression was carefully neutral, but the way he hesitated before speaking sent a chill through Cashin's chest. "We found something." Cashin didn't move, didn't breathe. Reese set a phone down on the desk. "Solene's. She never made it past the city limits." The words were quiet, but the implications were deafening. Cashin felt his pulse slow, then sharpen like a blade. She was gone. Not just out of his life, gone. His mind raced. Had Magnus taken her? Elias? Or had Juliet decided to remove the problem altogether? For the first time in years, Cashin felt something close to panic. He had pushed her away, but now he might never get her back. And that realization shook him to his core. Cashin had never felt powerless. Not even when he was a boy running from the wreckage of his past. But this was something else. The city stretched out beneath him as he stood at the window, his reflection nothing more than a shadow. She was out there, alone, in danger, and it was his fault. Reese stood behind him, speaking in a low, measured voice. No ransom demand, no sightings. Whoever took her knew how to cover their tracks. Cashin's fingers curled into fists. Then find them. His security team had already swept through every lead. Juliet, Magnus, even Elias. None of them had taken her. That only made it worse. If he couldn't find her, he couldn't protect her. And for the first time, he understood the weight of that truth. She wasn't just someone he had let into his life. She was the only thing that had ever made him question what he was willing to lose. The thought of her being afraid, of her thinking he had abandoned her, it was unbearable. His phone buzzed, and he answered before the second ring. "Tell me you have something." Reese hesitated. Not her, but a message. Cashin's pulse hammered as Reese slid an envelope onto the desk. There was no name, no markings, only a single folded sheet inside. The words were scrawled in neat, deliberate handwriting. "I warned you. Some things were never meant to be yours." Cashin stared at the note, his blood running cold. This wasn't about business. It wasn't about revenge. It was about Solene. Whoever had taken her wasn't just trying to hurt him. They wanted to erase her. He crushed the paper in his fist, his voice lethal. "I don't care what it takes. Find her." Reese nodded, stepping out. Cashin remained still, the city burning in his reflection. They thought they could take her from him. They had no idea what he was willing to do to get her back. The cold bit into Solene's skin long before she opened her eyes. Her head ached, her wrists sore from the rough rope binding them. The dim light overhead flickered, casting uneven shadows against the bare concrete walls. She wasn't in the city anymore. This place felt abandoned, forgotten. A door creaked open. Solene forced herself to stay still, to breathe evenly, even as her pulse pounded in her throat. Footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate. And then, a familiar voice. "I was beginning to think you'd never wake up." Solene lifted her head, meeting Elias Cross's cold stare. He looked the same, sharp, dangerous, but there was something different in his eyes. Not just anger, something more personal. "You went through a lot of trouble for me," she said, her voice rough but steady. "Should I be flattered?" Elias smirked, tilting his head. "You're here because of Cashin." Solene forced herself not to react. Elias crouched beside her, watching her with a quiet intensity that made her skin crawl. You know what the problem with Cashin is? He mused. He thinks he can outrun the past. That if he builds his empire high enough, it will never reach him. His smirk faded. But some things don't stay buried. Soline's throat tightened. So you took me to get to him. Elias exhaled sharply, almost amused. Of course I did. You're his weakness. The words hit harder than she expected. Cashin wasn't supposed to care about her. He had spent so much time pushing her away, convincing her, and himself, that she was just a complication. But she had seen it in his eyes, felt it in the way he held her, in the way he kissed her like he was afraid of what it meant. And now, Elias saw it too. Soline kept her expression unreadable. And what's your plan? Elias stood, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeves. Simple. He walked toward the door, pausing just before leaving. I break him, and I start with you. The door slammed shut behind him. Soline exhaled shakily, her hands clenching into fists. She wasn't naive. She knew Cashin would come for her. But she also knew that Elias wasn't just planning to hurt him. He was planning to destroy him. And Cashin, the man who never lost, was finally playing a game where he had everything to lose. Cashin had always been a man of control, calculated, precise, ruthless. But tonight, none of that mattered. He gripped the gun tighter, his knuckles white as he stepped out of the SUV. The abandoned warehouse loomed ahead, a relic of the city's forgotten underbelly. It was the perfect place for a trap. Elias wanted him desperate. He had succeeded. Cashin had spent his life protecting his empire, ensuring that no one could take what was his. But for the first time, he was willing to burn it all down. For her. Reese adjusted his earpiece, his tone clipped. We have men surrounding the perimeter, but no visuals on Soline. They're keeping her deep inside. Cashin exhaled slowly. We go in. No hesitation. Reese hesitated. Cashin didn't wait for him to finish. He was already moving. Soline sat against the cold wall, her wrists still bound, her body tense. She could feel it. Cashin was coming. She had spent enough time in his world to know what that meant. It wouldn't be a negotiation. It would be war. The door creaked open, and Elias stepped in, his expression unreadable. It's almost time. Soline met his gaze with quiet defiance. You think this will end the way you want it to? Elias smirked. It doesn't matter how it ends. He's already lost. A distant noise interrupted them. A gunshot. Then another. The air shifted. Elias's smirk faded. Then the first explosion hit. The walls trembled as a shockwave tore through the building. Smoke. Shouting. Chaos. And then, gunfire. Soline's heart slammed against her ribs. He's here. Elias swore under his breath, reaching for his gun. But before he could react, the door burst open. Cashin. His silhouette was carved against the smoke, his gun raised, eyes burning with lethal fury. Elias barely had time to aim before Cashin fired. The bullet tore into his shoulder, sending him crashing back against the wall. Soline gasped as Cashin strode forward, grabbing Elias by the collar and slamming him against the concrete. You should have killed me when you had the chance. Elias grinned, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. And you should have stayed the monster you were. Cashin's grip tightened. He could end this. Right now. But then, Soline's voice. Cashin. Don't. His jaw clenched. She was right. Killing Elias wouldn't fix this. Wouldn't take back what was lost. Cashin exhaled sharply before releasing his grip. Elias slumped to the ground, coughing. Then Cashin turned to Soline, his hands already working at the ropes around her wrists. For the first time, she saw it. The relief, the fear, the love. She could barely whisper. You came for me. Cashin cupped her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek. There was never a choice. The fire behind them raged, but the only thing that mattered was that she was safe, that she was his. The fire raged behind them, smoke curling toward the ceiling as the warehouse trembled under the weight of destruction. Gunfire echoed through the halls. But for a moment, nothing else existed. Soline's wrists burned from where Cashin had cut the ropes, but she barely noticed. All she saw was him. His eyes were still fierce, still dangerous, but different now. This wasn't the cold, untouchable man she had met. This was Cassian Vaughn stripped bare, raw, reckless, willing to die for her. But then Elias moved. Solene barely had time to react before she saw it. The flash of a gun, the glint of metal aimed directly at her. Her breath caught, too fast, and then Cassian. He moved before she could. A gunshot rang out. Time seemed to fracture, reality slowing into unbearable stillness. Cassian staggered, his body jolting from the force of the bullet. Solene's world shattered. He fell to one knee, his breath sharp, his hand pressing against his side, dark red spilling through his fingers. Elias laughed, a broken, breathless sound. "You really are pathetic, Vaughn." Solene barely heard him. All she could see was Cassian, pale, struggling to stay upright, his breath coming in uneven drags. Panic rose in her throat, but she shoved it down. Now was not the time for fear. Cassian lifted his gun, still steady despite the blood pooling beneath him. One shot. Elias's body hit the floor, and then Cassian collapsed. No, no, no. Solene dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against his wound, desperate to stop the bleeding. His eyes fluttered open, the edges of his lips curling just slightly. "You're crying." Her vision blurred. "You're bleeding, you idiot." Cassian exhaled a slow, pained laugh. "It's just a scratch. You're not funny." His gaze softened. "You're beautiful when you're worried." Solene clenched her jaw, ignoring the sharp sting behind her eyes. "Shut up and stay awake." He studied her, something unreadable in his expression, like he wanted to memorize her. Solene swallowed hard. "You can't die, Cassian." He smirked, but it was weaker now. "Why not?" She took a shaky breath, her fingers tightening over his. "Because I love you, that's why." His breath caught. For the first time, his walls cracked completely. "Say it again." Solene leaned closer, her forehead pressing against his. "I love you." Cassian exhaled, his grip tightening around her wrist. "Then I guess I have to stay." A distant siren wailed, but all that mattered was him. And this time, she wasn't letting go. The city moved on, as it always did. Glass towers still gleamed, deals were still made, power still shifted in silent wars behind closed doors. But Cassian Vaughn was no longer a part of it. He stood on the penthouse balcony, looking out over the skyline that had once been his entire world. Every building, every deal, every empire built on control. And now, none of it mattered. The bandage around his side was tight, the wound healing, but the real ache sat deeper. A weight he had carried for years, one he was finally ready to set down. Solene appeared beside him, a quiet presence in the night. She leaned against the railing, looking out at the view with an unreadable expression. He knew what she was thinking. "You're really doing it," she said softly. Cassian exhaled slowly. "It was never really mine to begin with." She turned to him then, eyes searching. "Are you sure?" It wasn't hesitation. It was something else. A reminder that he had built himself into this world, that stepping away meant becoming something new. But Cassian had already made his choice. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek, silver key. He turned it over between his fingers before placing it on the balcony ledge. His final tie to Vaughn Enterprises. Solene watched as the wind threatened to take it, but it remained unmoved. "You spent your whole life chasing power." Her voice was quiet, thoughtful. "A name, a reputation." Cassian's lips twitched. "And look where it got me." Her hand found his, fingers sliding between his own. "And now?" she asked. Cassian studied her, taking in the warmth of her touch, the quiet certainty in her gaze. She was his now, not because he owned her, but because she had chosen him. "Now," he murmured, lifting her hand to his lips, "I chased something else." The wind carried away the silver key, letting it fall into the unknown below. And Cassian didn't look back. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, the waves crashing against the shore with a steady rhythm. A sound of renewal, a sound of something untouched by the past. Solene stood barefoot in the sand, the wind pulling at her hair, her fingers wrapped around the warmth of a coffee mug. The world felt different here, slower, softer. She had never imagined this kind of peace. Not after everything. A door creaked behind her, and she turned as Cashin stepped onto the porch, a towel slung over his shoulder, hair damp from a morning swim. He looked different. Not the man who had ruled from glass towers and shadows. Not the man who had carried a name that wasn't his. No expensive suits. No guarded expression. Just him. Cashin. Hers. "You're up early," he said, his voice still rough from sleep. Solene smiled softly. "I like the mornings here." Cashin stepped beside her, his hand brushing against her lower back before settling there, grounding them both. "No regrets?" She tilted her head, studying him. "Do you?" He exhaled, looking back at the waves. "I used to think power was everything. That control was survival." He turned to her, eyes steady. "But then I lost you. And I realized none of it meant anything if I didn't have something real." Solene swallowed past the lump in her throat. They had survived too much to pretend this was anything less than a choice. A deliberate, fearless leap into the unknown. Together, she reached up, fingers tracing the faint scar near his temple, a reminder of the life he had left behind. "You're different now," she whispered. Cashin smirked. "You think so?" She nodded. "I do." His fingers curled beneath her chin, tilting her face toward his. "You're the only thing I've ever been sure of, Solene." The wind carried away her breath as he kissed her. Slow, deep, filled with everything they hadn't said but had always known. This was their new beginning. Not built on power. Not built on fear. Just them. And for the first time, Cashin Vaughn didn't need anything else. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the coastline. The waves rolled in steady, unbothered by the world beyond them. It was quiet here. Safe. Solene sat on the porch steps, her knees tucked against her chest, watching the horizon. She had never known a life like this. One without fear, without running, without the weight of things unsaid pressing against her ribs. And yet, something stirred inside her. A feeling she couldn't name, but one she couldn't ignore. Behind her, the wooden boards creaked under Cashin's steps. She didn't need to look to know it was him. His presence had become as familiar as her own shadow. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need. Then, Cashin exhaled. A slow, measured breath, as if he had been carrying something heavy, something unspoken. "I never thought I'd have this." His voice was quiet, rough around the edges. A life that wasn't built on power, or revenge, or survival. Solene turned to him. "And now?" Cashin met her gaze, something deep and certain flickering behind his eyes. "Now I know what I want." He reached into his pocket, pulling out something small, something silver that caught the last light of the day. Solene's breath caught. A ring. Simple, unadorned, but meaningful. Cashin didn't kneel. He didn't need to. Instead, he took her hand, pressing the ring into her palm. "This isn't about claiming you. It's not about control or ownership. It's about choosing you." His thumb brushed against her wrist, against the pulse that beat steadily beneath his fingertips. "Every day. For as long as you'll have me." Solene swallowed, her chest tight with something vast and overwhelming. She thought of the man she had first met, cold, guarded, unreachable, and the man in front of her now, willing, open, hers. She curled her fingers around the ring. Then, she smiled. "It's always been you, Cashin." She slid the ring onto her finger, and Cashin let out a quiet breath, like he had been holding it for longer than he realized. He leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. "Forever," he murmured. Solene kissed him softly, sealing a promise that needed no words. "Forever," she whispered. And for the first time in their lives, they had something no one could take away. The night was quiet, the waves a soft hum against the shore. The world felt smaller here, simpler. Just the two of them, wrapped in the kind of silence that spoke louder than words. Solene lay beside Cashin on the sand, the sky stretching infinitely above them. For the first time, neither of them were running, neither of them were fighting. Just existing. Together. Cashin turned his head, watching her as the moonlight traced the delicate curve of her face. She was the only thing that had ever truly belonged to him, not because he had taken her, but because she had chosen him. What? Solene murmured, sensing his gaze. He smirked, reaching out, brushing his fingers against hers. Just memorizing this. She smiled, lacing her fingers with his. You don't have to. I'm not going anywhere. Cashin exhaled slowly, his thumb brushing the inside of her wrist, where her pulse beat steady beneath his touch. A reminder that she was real, that this was real. I used to think love was a weakness, he admitted. Solene shifted closer, resting her head against his shoulder. And now? He pressed a slow, lingering kiss against her hair, his grip tightening around her hand. Now, I know it's the only thing that ever made me strong. The wind carried away his words, but she heard them. She felt them. Solene lifted her head, tilting her face toward his. Cashin kissed her softly, deeply. One last promise, sealed not in desperation, but in certainty. Their pasts had been forged in darkness, but they had found their light in each other. And this time, neither of them were letting go.